next installment of our female executive video interview series. We're joined by Teresa Condicion. Teresa is a fantastic example of someone who's come from quite a diverse background to reach a CEO status, and we're eager to hear her story today. Teresa was a chemical engineer by trade. She then had her first job as a scientist with Procter & Gamble. 17 years later, across multiple countries and regions, she left to start her first company as a co-founder and CEO. She then, after 4.5 years, started her second company, Shoplinks, as a co-founder and CEO now, which is across Philippines, Singapore, and soon to launch in Indonesia. So watch this space. And we're happy to have you, Teresa.
It's very good to have you. Very good to be here. Very excited to be talking about this. Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right into it. You've reached quite a serious level of success along your career. If anything, though, have you had to sacrifice something along the journey?
Absolutely. I think all of us can only do a few things that, really well at any point in time. And just like everyone else, I have multiple priorities, and I have only 24 hours a day. Being a mother, being an entrepreneur, being a wife, being fit, being a friend. And it's impossible to do them all while trying to achieve a lot, especially in business. And so I love guitar, for example, or I love writing. I have many of these hobbies that I had to let go of because I just didn't have the time for them. And many times I could not see my friends because of the focus in the business. But I think the one thing that I regretted the most was that at one point I was traveling half the time because I was managing across Southeast Asia, going to Brazil even at some point because Snapcart had operations there. And I had a 3-year-old son that I missed a lot of his life during that period. And that was a loss. But I think what was important for me, it was not so much that I sacrificed. I think everybody sacrifices something. What I learned was what we shouldn't sacrifice, which was actually counterproductive if we do so. And for me, that was family, that was health, right? That was friendships, relationships. And I realized that if I do that, I actually become less productive as a leader. It starts becoming counterproductive. And so I learned that being a good leader is about being a happy leader. And only when you're happy can you really be effective. And that's the thing I learned along the way.
Did you experience any barriers to your success?
Many. I will give one example. I had the privilege of having had a very diverse experience, living in the Philippines, Singapore, China at one point, having been in corporate, startup, being technical, but also, having leadership skills that I have learned along the way, having met so many people from all forms of life, coming from a fishing village in the Philippines where I grew up to Singapore, which is, very vibrant. But I have always felt very hesitant to speak. And I had a lot of self-doubts, which was probably the underlying cause of that. So I remember vividly one time when I was first invited by my school as an alumni to talk about my experiences in corporate, and I just froze. and I just couldn't say a word. And I think that stayed with me, and I avoided kind of speaking engagements. I avoided even in my corporate role, I avoided that. So until at some point I couldn't avoid them anymore, right? As an entrepreneur, you have to pitch to hundreds of investors. You have to speak to an organization that was rapidly growing in size. You have to talk to reporters and to journalists for interviews. You have to appear on TV and be seen by millions of people. At first, I was incapacitated, but then I just had to get through it. And I realized that actually a lot of this is two things. One, it was just a muscle that I had to build. Public speaking was something that I just have to do again and again until I feel confident about it. And then it becomes a little bit more second nature. And the second one is that it was a lot in my mindset, a lot of self-doubt. And I think that's something that I struggled with, but had to battle along the way. And still always every now and again comes up, but it just takes practice.
So what are some traits of a leader that you admire?
Yeah, I have so many leaders I admire. But I think there are two types of leaders that I really, really, really look up and aspire to be. The first one are those people who lead by purpose. And the second one is those people who lead by humility. And I think I have always loved how Gandhi, for example, led the nation, Mother Teresa, and her humble purpose and leadership, and being able to galvanize huge amount of following in order to achieve what they wanted to achieve. Of course, people like Jeff Weiner, he's also very capable in the corporate setting, but very compassionate as well. So these are my favorite leaders.
The best advice you've ever received?
Well, one time when I just got promoted to a leadership position in P&G, there was one executive who came to me and congratulated me, but also said to me one advice. And that was, now that you're a leader, your whisper is like thunder. And it was very interesting because what she was basically saying was that anything that you say can actually move your organization in directions that you didn't even anticipate. Words that you say have a lot more meaning, can make or break a person's day. It can also make them overly prioritize a feature the minute you speak a lot more, right? And so I learned how to be very careful with my words. And I learned to be a lot more deliberate about it. I'll give you an example. Sometimes an engineer comes and has developed a complex feature that is, 98, 99% correct. The first tendency of our brain is to find that 1%. And if I follow the instinct of what my brain tells me, because our brain is naturally towards finding what's different from your expectations. But if I listen to that instinct, I would have not met my objective. And my objective was to be able to motivate and drive us to that 100%. And so if I become more deliberate in the way I speak, I would acknowledge the 99% first rather than the 1%.
Did you think of yourself as a future leader or along?
Not at all, not at all. 10 years old, I imagined myself to be a scientist. I dreamt of beakers and test tubes and blue smoke all over. And so that's why I took chemical engineering. I love mathematics. That was my passion. And then I moved to P&G. I learned analytics. And then over time, I kept on receiving the feedback that you're brilliant, but you're just too technical to be a leader. And you just don't have enough leadership presence. And that plus the fact that I thought leadership was about telling people what to do. And I grew up in poverty and in the small fishing village where I just couldn't imagine myself telling this. I didn't have an example of success, and I would never be able to imagine myself telling this wonderful Ivy League executives what to do. But I couldn't be more wrong. And it was very interesting because I grew up more in a personal life. I was more of a leader. I had to grow up very fast because my sister was born with cerebral palsy, and therefore my parents, who had very little means, right, had to focus on her, on how to take care of her. And so I had to take care of my other siblings. We were also poor, so it was upon me to take my family out of poverty. And so I was focused on driving the family to success, getting myself educated, helping my siblings get educated, with a very single-minded purpose. So I realized that the disconnect between the corporate world, where I didn't feel entitled enough to be a leader, and my personal life was two things. One is that sense of that mindset that I could not, but more importantly, the purpose. I had a clear purpose in my personal life about taking my family out of poverty. And that made me a leader because I knew that I had to do that and I was motivated to do that. And so now I realize that a leader is somebody who has a purpose, who knows how to communicate that purpose, who knows how to galvanize and find people who share the same purpose, who can then execute that purpose with excellence and kindness. And as long as you have that, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what the context, right? You will be able to do it. And now I have always had a purpose of helping my family get out of poverty. And now I have the purpose of bringing a broader economic impact towards even the smallest retailer to have the capabilities of data and technology in order to compete in an increasingly digitized world. And that's the same purpose, for example, that I have in sending 100 kids to school every year, right? I have this overriding purpose of, I grew up with very little resources and I want to be able to provide the resources that I know how to provide. And that makes leadership easier to understand and easier to execute for me.
As a female leader, have you had any assumptions or biases that you've been exposed to or experiences that are unique to being a female leader?
It's very interesting, John, that question, because I grew up with the privilege of not knowing that there's a difference between a woman and a man, right? I grew up in the Philippines where gender gap is one of the smallest in the world. It is number 2 in terms of size of the gender gap, in terms of how small it is, or number 9 between those two, right? So I did not know that there was a difference. And then I went to PNG, which is also very, very diversity focused. So there's no difference between a man and a woman. But then I went into entrepreneurship, and I then started seeing, started hearing a lot of repeating questions that was, at first I ignored, like, who's taking care of the kid? Or, do you understand machine learning? Do you understand mathematics, right? At first, I was answering them, I understand machine learning. I studied it in 2007 when it was just beginning, and I love mathematics. And then, my children, they're being taken care of by the dad and by his grandparents, so they're okay. So I felt like just answering them repeatedly. But then in one conference, I was being asked the same question about 10 times. And that was the first question that I was asked. Not what I was doing, but who's taking care of the kid? Very upset about it, that I just said, his dad and his grandparents. How about you? Who's taking care of yours? So I try to avoid that question these days. And I just try to ignore it and understand it. But yeah, these are some differences that I see as a female leader.
Is there any other ways that you've gained more confidence in yourself over the years?
Self-care, John. As I said in the beginning, a person who is happy, who is well, is able to better lead. And it is counterproductive to not be well as a leader before you can lead people. You are relied on for decisions, you are relied on for motivation, you are relied on for the feeling of well-being of a greater team. What you do is very contagious and can really impact the whole team. So caring for yourself and really ensuring that you exercise, you sleep well, is probably the most important thing I realized was going to help me. When I first started meditating, for example, that was the first time I realized all the silly self-doubt, self-criticisms I was telling myself. And just being aware of that, just being aware that it was a mindset, a thought process, really helped me clear that out much better, and really made me understand that, hey, that's just a thought, that's not real, right? And so that's one example, meditation, but also exercise. I think these are important things to do as a leader.
What's one thing you've learned recently that you would not have believed 6 months ago?
Many, and I'm sure a lot of that are very surprised about all the things that happened in the last 6 months, especially because of COVID. One example for me is remote work. I think I've always loved the flexibility of remote work, and I've always believed, I've been working from home for many, many years, and I have led people from remote teams. But what I didn't understand is that it can actually even be more productive overall. Of course, there'll always be things that are not perfect either way, but it can be more productive overall, and especially in our kind of work, right, where we're building software, we're building capabilities. And I think that was something that I learned. It was not about being together, it was about being able to communicate well and being able to trust each other to deliver. And when I understood that the underlying reason why teams are productive is because they communicate well, that can be done not without being together, right? And you start fixing that issue versus being very obsessed about co-location. So we learned, for example, how to build asynchronous communication. We learned very, very clear ways of communicating in the context of remote. And that was a very interesting learning for me. But there are many other learnings that I had along the way, but perhaps this is one of the most profound in terms of how I run the business.
Answer this question and then expand. My hometown is, and that's important to me because
I grew up in a small village called Binabusan, Lian, Batangas, in the Philippines. It was a very small village, about 1,000 people. My father was a farmer who eventually started selling small, in what we call sari store, a mom and pop store in front of our house. It is important for me. There I learned a lot of things. I grew up in crime, in extreme poverty, in hopelessness. But I will always see that as an integral part of me, because that's also what taught me to have a purpose. It has kept me grounded. It has taught me what's possible in life, even with limited resources. It has taught me how to do my duties and now pave the way for other people who must be struggling like me. So I will always be looking back at my village and seeing that as my identity.
To all your mentees out there and to everyone listening, what's the best advice you have for them to differentiate themselves?
For me, it's being authentic, being yourself, acknowledging that you are good as you are, not trying to be someone else. I've seen a lot of female leaders try to be men. And I think that's wrong. I think each one has a different style that can be brought to the table that can really, really be very beneficial because of that diverse thoughts and diverse types of leadership. I think each one has its own strength. And I think being ourselves and not doubting that is super important. And I think remembering that for as long as we do things with purpose and kindness, and that understanding that any big task can be broken down into very small pieces that are palatable and can be done, I think nothing can stop us.
Teresa, your story is really inspiring on so many levels. But simply put, you have an awful lot to share, and with coming from a scientist to now being CEO and founder of a super successful firm that's about, again, to launch in Indonesia, we can't thank you enough.